Welcome back. We continue with the analysis following Donald Trump's electoral victory on Tuesday. We are joined by journalist Benjamin Norton. Benjamin, welcome to From the South.
Thanks for having me.
It's always our pleasure. So we saw yesterday Donald Trump win not only in electoral votes, but also in popular votes for the first time, winning also among Hispanic, Afro-American, and women voters. How can we explain this?
Well, a few things. First of all, the situation in the economy has been very difficult. If there's really one factor that led to Trump's victory, it's the economy. High rates of inflation, extremely high costs of housing and food. And if you look at polls, many people said that their number one issue was the economy. So we've seen, especially after the pandemic, there were very high rates of inflation, and this has really hurt a lot of working people. There's also a lot of growing inequality. Now, it's quite ironic because Donald Trump is a billionaire, and he has pledged to cut taxes on the rich, and he was funded by many billionaires. So I don't think Trump will actually have solutions to these problems. But the reality is that Kamala Harris is, of course, vice president under Joe Biden, and she's associated with many of the economic problems in the U.S. So she didn't really provide any solutions to people. She did not distinguish herself from Joe Biden. So people said, why would we continue voting for her when the situation economically is so bad? Prices are high, inflation is high. That was the most important factor, but there are other things. Another reason is it looks like turnout was quite low. And one of the reasons that turnout for the Democrats was so low is because Kamala Harris was not a popular candidate. She did not really offer anything new or exciting. She basically said, I'm the continuation of Joe Biden, who's not popular. And we cannot forget the genocide going on in Gaza. Kamala Harris has, like Joe Biden, staunchly supported Israel as it has supported this horrific massacre of Palestinians. And this is why it hasn't officially been announced yet, but it's almost certain that Donald Trump won Michigan. Michigan is an important swing state that has a large Arab population, and many Arab Americans said that they were not going to vote for Kamala Harris, despite the fact that they had previously voted for Joe Biden, as a form of protest against her support for the genocide in Gaza. So the Democrats didn't offer people anything. Their campaign slogan was, "We are not Donald Trump." They didn't say, we're going to give you health care, we're going to give you housing. Instead, they said, vote for us because Donald Trump is horrible. And the Democrats, Kamala Harris, were actually campaigning with many Republicans, including Liz Cheney, the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney, who is a horrible right-wing war criminal. So when the Democrats don't offer anything that actually helps people, they lose. This is exactly what happened in 2016. Hillary Clinton did not offer anything to anyone. She did not claim that she would make the economy better for working people. And she ran a very centrist, center-right campaign with a bunch of Republicans. Her only slogan was, we're not Donald Trump, and she lost. So the Democrats learned nothing, and they repeated the same mistakes.
With Trump's history of imposing tariffs, how might his administration and trade policies affect global markets and economies, particularly in relation to China and Mexico?
It's going to be very hectic, and I think it's going to cause a lot of economic problems. So Donald Trump, let's not forget, began the trade war on China in his first term from 2017 to 2021. And honestly, the Biden administration continued many of the policies of economic war against China. However, the Biden administration's tariffs against China were specific. They were targeted tariffs against Chinese electric vehicles, China's solar panels, China's batteries. So they were specific targeted tariffs. Trump has pledged that he's going to put blanket tariffs of 60% on all Chinese exports. This is going to cause a lot of problems considering that about 10% of China's exports go to the United States. Now, China could redirect those exports to another country like Mexico or like Vietnam. And then what happens is that in Mexico or Vietnam, they could add some kind of value to the production process and then export it to the US and say that the good was made in Mexico or made in Vietnam. So that's a potential way around these tariffs on Chinese goods. However, what that also means is that the cost of those products is going to increase, which is likely going to lead to more inflation in the US. So I think we're entering a period where there's going to be more inflation. Now, in terms of Mexico, it could actually ironically help Mexico. It depends what the Trump administration does. If they do not put further tariffs on Chinese goods made in Mexico by a Chinese company and then exported to the US, that could help Mexico. However, if Trump puts tariffs on Chinese goods that are made in Mexico and exported to the US, it's going to cause damage to both China and to Mexico, and it will cause damage to the US because it will lead to higher prices for consumers in the US. So this policy that Trump has proposed, I think could really backfire and do damage to the US, but it's part of this strategy of economic war against China, which the US sees as its main adversary.
One of the promises Trump has made was that he could end the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I think he once said he could do so in less than 24 hours. What can we expect going forward in this regard?
Well, Trump likes to brag and he exaggerates, and sometimes he says things like he'll do it in 24 hours. I don't think it's going to happen in 24 hours. However, Trump has expressed interest in this. This means that maybe the U.S. will be willing to negotiate. However, if the U.S. continues to send weapons to Ukraine, which is what Trump did in his first term, he sent weapons to Ukraine, then obviously that's not going to end the war. If he's serious about ending the war, Russia has made many proposals for peace. This goes back to March of 2022, when Russia joined peace talks in Turkey, and also in Belarus. So Russia has expressed interest, but Russia has a few demands that are non-negotiable. First of all, Ukraine must be neutral. It cannot join NATO. Ukraine must be demilitarized, and there must be some kind of agreement reached that will not allow Ukraine in the future to be remilitarized and to join NATO. So that if they sign an agreement and then there's a change of government and then the Democrats come in, they just completely change the plan. This is what happened with the Iran nuclear deal. Iran signed a nuclear deal with the Obama administration, and then Trump came in and he tore up the deal. So Russia wants to make sure that there's some kind of agreement. It won't change if a Democrat comes in a few years and tears it up. It's very difficult to negotiate with the U.S. So I think Russia is willing to do so. Maybe Trump will, but Trump often says a lot of things and doesn't actually accomplish them. So we'll see what actually happens. And also, of course, inside NATO, the U.S. is the leader of NATO, but there are other countries in NATO in Europe, and many of them do not want peace with Russia. So I think inside NATO, there will be some conflicts between Trump and some of the European countries. We'll see what happens. It's going to be, I think, pretty difficult. But if there is some kind of end to the conflict, some people expect that it could look like the end to the Korean War. So the Korean War was waged between 1950 and 1953. However, the war ended, but there was never a peace deal signed. There was never a formal treaty. So if the war in Ukraine ends, perhaps it'll be like the Korean option where the war ends, but there's not a formal treaty that ends the conflict.
Another topic that has been on top of the agenda of the different discussions, aside from immigrations, conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine, has been climate. What impacts do you expect Trump's policies to have on international climate agreements and global efforts to combat climate change, taking into consideration his first term?
This is going to be one of the biggest impacts of the second Trump administration. In terms of foreign policy, Trump and Biden honestly have not been that different. Biden continued staunch support for Israel and its genocide in Gaza. Biden continued putting sanctions on Cuba and Venezuela. Biden continued this very aggressive policy against China. However, one area where there's going to be a very big difference is on the climate. Now, Biden actually offered many new contracts for oil and gas companies in the US. So even though he says that he wants to, fight climate change, Biden has been pretty hypocritical. However, Trump is much, much worse. Trump does not accept that climate change is happening. Trump wants to massively expand oil production in the US, which is going to be very bad for the climate. Trump doesn't care about renewable energy technology. So I think this is going to do a lot of damage to the climate because, of course, the US is per capita the world's largest carbon emitter in terms of the size of its population. And historically, it has been the world's largest carbon emitter. So that means that the US is likely going to do a lot of damage to the climate. And this is going to hurt other countries, especially countries like in the tropics, countries that are island nations that are already dealing with hurricanes and extreme weather. So I think this is going to be something that's going to do a lot of damage. And it's going to show actually how a country like China is a more responsible global leader, because China has been taking up on the global stage, taking up the leadership role in fighting climate change. China has been transitioning very quickly to solar panels, to wind turbines. It's been moving toward other forms of renewable technology and electric vehicles. It's building a lot of nuclear plants which don't emit carbon. So China is actually going to be seen on the global stage as a country that takes climate change very seriously and is fighting climate change and promoting sustainable development. And the US is going to be seen as a pariah that is violating all of these policies like the Paris Agreement. And let's not forget that Donald Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement. So that's an example of how the US is going to be seen as a very irresponsible country.
Thank you, Benjamin, for your time and your inputs here from the South.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's always our pleasure.